Hi folks, we're just going to leave it just for about another 30 seconds or a minute until a few latecomers come on, and then we'll start then. Okay, thanks. I think, folks, we'll just actually make a start. It's 2 minutes past 7 there, and if any latecomers come on, then they can join us as we go. So, just by introduction, just like to welcome you all to this NIIAS webinar tonight. I know there's some non-members that have joined us. My name is Peter McCann. I'm the current chair of NIIAS, and I'm also the Northern correspondent with the Irish Farmers Journal. And I also do a bit of farming myself, sheep and suckers here in North County Derry. We're delighted to have Vicky Robinson with us tonight to speak. Vicky is a principal advisor at Natural England, and basically she's here tonight to talk about what's happening in England with agricultural policy, and obviously we're in the post-Brexit era now, and she's going to give some background to the agricultural transition period, the move away from the basic payment scheme that we all know, and towards these schemes that are public money for public goods, as we often hear. So I often really wonder, what does that actually mean in practice? So I'm delighted that Vicky's with us tonight to maybe give us some background to that in terms that ordinary farmers that like myself would understand. Vicky also has done a Nuffield scholarship, and her theme of that was about farmer to farmer knowledge transfer. So she might, if she's time, run through a few of the key points from that. Folks, we'll have a Q&A session after Vicky's presentation as usual. So throughout her talk, you can fire the questions in there to the Q&A box in the bottom, and we can go through. And also, once we start the Q&A session, you can continue to ask questions there. The plan is to be wrapped up really on this webinar in about 45 minutes or so, and NIIAS members then will receive an email over the course of the webinar to join a separate Zoom meeting just to run through just the AGGM for NIIAS. So just Steve Miller will run through the accounts, and we'll just have the election of members to the committee again. So that's enough for me. I'm just going to hand over to Vicky now. Vicky, you can share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can I check that you can see my first slide?
Yeah, spot on, Vicky. Looks good.
Brilliant. Well, I will go straight onto my second slide. So my plan is to talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. But do record questions in the Q&A as I go, and then Peter at the end is going to check for any particular themes or any questions. I'm going to chair that session. So in terms of, let me just get to the next slide, what I'm going to cover. Can you see my next slide, Peter? Can you just nod? Yeah, brilliant. So what I'm going to cover, I thought I'd do a bit of the background about, provide a bit about information about my background, and then talk about a bit of context to the agricultural transition, but then go into a lot more detail about one of the tests and trials that's been developed for the new schemes around payment by results or results-based agri-environment payments. So I know that was very much the focus of this. And then, as Peter said, if there's time, I will touch on my Nuffield as well, which was actually inspired by the farmers I was involved with who were taking part in the payment by result pilot. So a bit about my background. The photo on the slide is the farm that I grew up on, which is near a town called Woodstock in Oxfordshire, which is sort of central south UK. It's an arable farm and now run by my brother in partnership with my parents. And after completing a degree in agriculture and equine business management at Royal Agricultural College, as it was then, I decided to actually focus on an increasing interest I had in environment and combine my passion for both farming and the environment. And for the last 21 years, I've worked on agri-environment schemes for Natural England, its various predecessors. So Natural England is one of Defra's arm's length bodies, and we provide statutory advice to the government around nature and conservation. And my particular work area is that technical expertise on agri-environment schemes. Spent about 15 years out on farm working on the schemes, but probably about the last 6 years working more in sort of helping support, providing technical advice to Defra and the Rural Payments Agency on the development and implementation of policy. And at the moment, I've just moved focus away from countryside stewardship to focusing on environmental land management. And I've got a team who work with me on environmental land management, providing that subject matter expertise. So what I want to do now is provide a bit of a background and an update on what's going on in England. So what this slide shows is what's happening to the basic payment scheme as we start transition. So the transition period is running from 2021 to 2027. So we've just kicked off this year. And what the government has published so far is the impact on payments up until 2024. And the rationale behind that is that the government guaranteed the spend on agriculture up until the end of the current government, term of the government, and the latest that can be is 2024. So what you can see here on the table on the left is the percentage of reductions. And as you can see, the more payment you get, the steeper the reduction. So if you're receiving over £150,000 worth of payment, by 2024, that will have reduced by 70%. And the table on the right shows that in actual monetary values. So if you're receiving currently £160,000, then by 2024, you'll be receiving 62. And this has been published, information's been coming out over the last few months. And I think, you know, seeing information like that, it's really starting to sort of land in the industry quite what the changes that are going to happen to their basic payment scheme. And obviously people, you know, planning for the future. And the budget's been reprioritised. So what this slide shows, the chart on the left, is the current and the sort of percentage that we currently have. As you can see, the majority goes on the basic payment schemes, on direct payments, with a smaller percentage on environmental and a small percent on improving farm prosperity. And that pretty much that stays the same all the way through. But by 2024, that will be flipped. So by 2024, the majority is going to be spent on the environment and animal welfare, with much less on direct payments. And the aspiration is, and the policy is that by 2027, those direct payments will have been reduced to zero. So what's happening? So it's been termed, the term, I will use the term ELM. ELM is actually being replaced by 3 separate schemes under the banner of rewarding environmental land management. So the 3 schemes that are sustainable farming incentive, local nature recovery, and landscape recovery. And they're there to deliver 6 objectives that I've just put up on the screen. I won't go through them, but the aim of these objectives is to support the rural economy to deliver the goals of the 25-year or Defra's 25-year environment plan, and also its ambitions around net zero. So these schemes are seen as a really important part of that. In terms of the timelines, so we are currently in 2021. So we are undergoing scheme design at the moment. Scheme design's been running for a number of years. It's obviously gathering pace as we move towards piloting. And we're also developing, there are tests and trials, and I'll go into a bit more detail about those shortly. Now, the ELM National Pilot, as it once was, is being replaced. This slide is slightly out of date, but it was the best one I could find with the delivery timeline, and I haven't got the technical skills to recreate it. So what's happening now is that they have just launched a pilot, phase 1 pilot for the Sustainable Farming Incentive. So that's been open for expressions of interest. There's been a really good interest, and it's going to be open shortly for people to actually apply. And then next year, they're going to pilot the local nature recovery, and they're also going to be putting a call out for pilots for the landscape recovery. So that ELM national pilot sort of been broken down into 3 separate schemes. But also next year, they are going to roll out elements of the Sustainable Farming Incentive more widely. So this is more widely than the pilot, so that there's a much wider range, a number of farmers and land managers can access the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme from next year. And then moving on down, as I said, direct payments are being phased out. And then we still have countryside stewardship. So countryside stewardship is our current agri-environment scheme, developed under the last round of CAP, and it's now under domestic controls. So it's evolved slightly. There was a real ambition to make it look and feel different for those agreements that started this year on the 1st of January, which were the first schemes that were under domestic controls. And that's going to run with the last applications in 2023, because from 2024 onwards, that's when the 3 schemes, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, Local Nature Recovery and Landscape Recovery, are going to be available to all. But what I'm going to do now is focus a bit more on payment by results, which is one of Defra's tests and trials. So Defra are very keen on co-creation. They're really looking to engage with farmers, with land managers, to help them co-create the schemes, to get them involved so that they're empowered and feel that they are, having a say in how these schemes are shaped. And they're doing this initially through the tests and trials. And these started in 2019. And as of September last year, there were about 60 tests and trials up and running, of which 5 had actually concluded. And they're covering a range of different themes, as this slide shows. So looking at the land management plan, which is seen as a key part of the environmental land management schemes, the role of advice and guidance within the 3 schemes, the spatial prioritization, how do we explain what we would like where, so that when farmers are applying, they're aware, obviously, what they've got on their farm, but what's the priority for Defra, thinking back to those 6 outcomes that we're focusing on. And they're very keen on collaboration. So that's to deliver, sort of landscape scale change, but there's a focus and a keenness on that peer-to-peer learning. And that was very much obviously chimes with my Nuffield, and something as a result I'm very passionate about. And then payments. Payments is always a very a topic that creates a lot of discussion, because at the moment, payments are based on an income foregone plus cost basis, which in years when commodities aren't particularly high, commodity prices can be great, but in years when commodity prices are high, aren't so good. So they tend to be fixed, and trying to sort of factor in that volatility can be challenging. And also often feedback we get is that there's no sort of profit built in, there's no incentive to encourage change. So, how can we do that, but equally, obviously, within WTO rules. And then finally, looking at the innovative delivery mechanism space, where we've got, for example, reverse auctions, and this is also where payment by results sits. So payment by results, or results-based agri-environment payment. So it's known as RBAPs, it's known as PBR. We use them interchangeably. They are one and the same thing. So the Defra trial was actually, before that, there was a 3-year EU-funded pilot, which started in 2016. And the EU provided some funding for piloting a payment by results approach. So they're very interested in it for the current round of CAP. And so Natural England, in partnership with the Yorkshire Dales National Park, put in a bid and secured some funding. The EU funding started in 2016. Partway through 2016, we had the EU referendum. And so the EU project concluded, and I'll be focusing quite a bit on that tonight, because that's the conclusions for that have been published. But obviously what we had a real increase domestically, a real interest in what was going on with this pilot. It created a lot of energy. The farmers that were involved in it were really passionate. And so Defra were very keen to look at this. And actually what they did was they extended the pilot. So the funding that we had and the farmers that we had involved in the EU element were offered the opportunity to continue, of which the majority of them did. And it then became one of Defra's test and trials. And it's looking at 3 questions, as you can see on this slide. It's looking at the environmental performance. Is there a difference if a farmer is paid with a results-based approach as opposed to a management or action-based approach? And I'll come on to that in a minute. Can farmers accurately self-assess their results? So farmers are self-assessing their plots, then there's 100% verification by either a Natural England or a Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority advisor. Do they come up with the same answer? And then finally, and most importantly, how are the farmers, what do the participants, the farmers, think about this approach? But payment by results is not a new thing. And I wanted to put this slide in because there are and have been a number of different projects looking at a payment by results approach historically, one of which I'm sure many of you have heard about is the Burren in Ireland. And then the EU funding, the 3 different pilots that the EU funded, one was in Romania, we had the one in England, another one had elements in Ireland and Spain. And the website address that's on this slide has got a wealth of information about payment by results. So it's a really good place to go to if you wanted to find out more. So as I said, what do we do at the moment? So currently in England, we have what we call a payment by management or payment by action based scheme. So farmers are provided, if they will apply for an option on a field. So they might say, right, my field's in species rich grassland, and they will get a list of instructions or prescriptions that they need to follow in order to be paid, irrespective of the quality of the outcome that is delivered. And then there's been, especially under the latest round of CAP, there's been a real requirement to provide evidence to prove that you have followed those prescriptions. So when there's a compliance inspection, the inspection will be saying, can you show me evidence that you've completed each one of these prescriptions? A results-based approach has no prescriptions. So the farmer has complete flexibility and freedom to choose how they deliver the results. And depending on how it's structured, and I'll go into more detail around what we did in our pilot, it provides motivation, especially if there are step payment rates, to gain recognition and reward. And I think that's important. Actually, that recognition and reward is a really important part of recognizing what someone's delivering in agri-environment. And the verification is on the results. And rather than have you followed the instructions, and the whole thing is it's the payments linked to the quality. And a word that comes up a lot when we're talking about is that it feels fair. So we were trialing in the pilot and the test and trials. We've got 4 habitats. We've got 2 in Yorkshire, which are the 2 grassland habitats, species rich hay meadows and grassland for breeding waders. Now they were selected because they tend to have a lot of prescriptions with them. So these were selected about which options would be best to pilot with a payment by results approach. So it was ones that have a lot of prescriptions that can make a very complicated agreement. So for example, for some of our grassland options, we've got 9 mandatory prescriptions and up to 19 optional prescriptions. So the idea is that a payment by results, which gets rid of all of those, can actually make things simpler. And the arable options, which were winter bird food and pollen and nectar, were chosen because of variability in delivery. So we've got evidence that there is great variability in delivery of these. And a lot of that variability is actually within the gift of the farmer. So for example, we've got evidence that the difference between good and poor winter bird food plots can make a 6-fold difference in the amount of seed provision. And a lot of that is around making timely management decisions. So you can follow the prescriptions, but if you don't actually do them in a timely manner and actually really concentrate and focus on those plots and visit them and keep an eye on them, then they can fail. And so it was really to see, would this approach encourage that care and attention that's needed to deliver these options? So in terms of the details, these are the areas and the number of farmers that we've got involved in the Defra test and trial. Some farmers have got both options, so some might have both grassland options, some farmers might just have one, and the same with the arable. And as you can see there, we've got some quite decent areas, in particular for the habitat for breeding waders, because they're sort of slightly larger fields that are coming into that. But even the species rich hay meadows, we've got 50 hectares with that. And quite a few farmers, when they transitioned from the EU pilot to the Defra test and trial, actually added in extra areas of land. They were really keen to do that. And the objectives at the bottom are just a sort of a high level objective for each of the 4 different options. So for the species rich hay meadow, there is a score based on the presence of positive and negative indicator species. For the breeding waders, we're actually looking at the structural characteristics. We don't use birds as an indicator. We're using the structure of the sward as a proxy for the presence of birds. We're often asked, why aren't you counting birds? But if you look at some of that, say that EU site on payment by results, it includes quite a lot of information about, what should you measure? And the idea is you measure things that are within the control of the farmer. And obviously birds and their presence or absence are not. Then with the winter bird food, we're looking at, and I'm going to go into quite a bit more detail around the arable, but it's the winter bird food. We're looking at seed bearing plants and a variety of different crops. And with the pollen and nectar, again, we're looking at a variety of different nectaring plants with good coverage on the plots. As I say, with this, the farmers carry out a self-assessment annually, and that is then translated into an annual payment. So what I want to do is just delve a bit more detail into the arable, just to give you a bit more of an idea of what we were doing. Now, I have got a slight bias towards the arable. I will admit I managed the project for the 3 years of the EU, and with an arable farming background, it's a particular interest to me. And what was particularly interesting about the arable is it had never had this approach applied to it. So with the grassland, some of the other projects had payment by results approach had been applied to grassland. With the arable, we were completely starting from scratch. And I think if we hadn't had a scheme to launch, probably 3 years later, we still would have been debating what does good look like for both these habitats, because we had to define it, but then we have to objectively measure it. And that was the challenge. And so you'll see from this slide some of the characteristics that we, and it was myself working with a team of technical experts, felt good should look like. And what was difficult is we all felt we could walk into a plot and we'd be like, yeah, this looks good or this looks poor. But actually trying to quantify that was quite a challenge. But ultimately, as it says at the bottom, for the winter bird food plot on the left, we want a plot that will provide an abundant and available supply of small seed during the autumn and winter months for farmland birds. And for pollen and nectar, on the right-hand side, a good plot will provide an essential food source for beneficial pollinators between early and late summer. So that was the ultimate that we were trying to look at. So what this ended up with winter bird food, that the farmers the assessment methodology was going out and doing 10 stops, representative stops, which was quite an interesting, seeing how what people and the farmers consider representative within the plot. And they were then putting a 1 meter quadrat down and actually looking at what crops were in that and counting the number of seed heads. And the next slide will show some of that detail. And we actually specifically had a list of which crops could count towards their results. And of course, it meant that they had the flex to include other crops. And maize is a one that often farmers are keen to put in, but it's not small seed, so we didn't include it on our list. But a farmer could have included it, but they had to take the risk then that it would compete with the crops that we were actually after and would count towards the results. And there was a threshold, because obviously one seed head of something like triticale as a cereal doesn't equate to one seed head of something like quinoa, which has a much bigger seed head. So we had to look at thresholds, and we based those thresholds working with the seed industry based on what would a typical mix, a good germination rate look like if, with a typical mix. With the pollen and nectar, we again had the 10 representative stops to look at sown species. Now, we didn't do a specific species list for this. We deliberately tried to test different parameters between the two options to test how farmers felt about it. This was a pilot after all, so we had the luxury of being able to do that. So we didn't specify what they had to put in their plot, just to see what type of mixes they did use. And in the first year, we were literally looking at the presence or absence of what they'd sown. And in the second year, we were looking at that plus cover. And the reason we didn't look at cover in the first year is to get these plots established well. You want to actually top them quite frequently in the first year. And we were concerned that if we looked at cover as well, one of the unintended consequences might be that the farmers didn't top them to get the cover. So we'd had slightly different assessment methodologies in the first and second year. So I'm going to show you then the winter bird food. So on the left hand side, so this is that threshold that I was talking about. So a farmer would put a quadrat down, and then they would look at what crops they got in there, and then they would look at the number of seed heads, and they got quicker. They did get, apparently the more you did, the quicker you got. And as soon as you had, for example, 4 seed heads of red millet, you could tick that crop was present in that quadrat. And then provided it appeared in 5 or more of the 10 quadrats, it could count as present in that plot. So the table on the right shows you the different tiers. So for the top tier, they would need to have 5 or more of those crops with that threshold of seed head met in 5 or more of their quadrats in their 10. And then they would receive £842 and down to 0. And it was interesting, the 0 payment rate has created a lot of discussion. Because what happens if there were factors outside the control, and I'll touch on that in the conclusions. And we had, as you can see here, the 6 payment tiers for the winter bird food. We had 10 for the pollen and nectar, and again that was a deliberate decision, because with 10 payment rates you actually have a smaller gap between them. So we wanted to test how that felt to the farmers. Did a smaller gap, which was maybe less incentive to move up the next one, but a lower risk in terms of fall. Did that feel better than 6 payment rates, where you had a bigger gap between the payment rates, but you had further to fall? So I'm going to move on now to the some of the results. So I'm going to focus on the EU results because the Defra test and trial, the report has been written, it hasn't been published yet. So I will focusing on the EU results which have been published. So just sort of in a high level summary, the winter bird food plots, the PBR plots statistically perform better than the baseline environmental stewardship and also the control plots, which are under countryside stewardship. Now, what was particularly interesting around both the arable plots is our baseline plots were other plots on the same farm as the payment by results plots, but being managed under an existing agri-environment scheme. So that payment by management approach that I explained earlier. So you have the same farmer, 2 different payment approaches, and the farmers were telling us, especially in the first year where they were finding their feet with the payment by results, they were making different management decisions on their payment by results plot, because it mattered, because if they didn't do something, they had a risk of not reaching that top payment rate, which is what they were all aiming for. Whereas with their environmental stewardship plots, the view was, well, you're going to pay me anyway. So difference were around the number, how the seedbed was created and the mix that was put in, a more expensive mix was put in some of the payment by results plots, and also some of the management decisions that were made as well. So it's a really interesting example, of that different approach, but same farmer. With the pollen and nectar, we didn't have anything that was statistically significant, but the payment by results plots did perform better than the control sites. The hay meadow, what was interesting with the hay meadow is generally we expect hay meadows to, they don't change that quickly, but actually we had a 24% increase in quality score over 2 years, which is statistically significant. And we think that was down to some of the farmers were doing enhancements. So we had some farmers planting plugs. We had other farmers walking along and gathering seed from species-rich verges or other fields and establishing it. But also with those negative indicator species, we were seeing farmers control those. So there wasn't so many of the negative indicator species. Breeding wader, there was a drop, but it wasn't a big as drop as the control. We had 2 really dry springs for the EU element of the pilot, and it made, that they impacted on the scores when they were assessed in the spring. So the farmers, what did the farmers think? And I'm not going to go through all of these one by one, but basically they really enjoyed that flexibility and freedom. And a word, as I said, that came up a lot with them was it felt fair. They felt they were rewarded for the effort they were putting in. And something that a lot of them enjoyed was the learning. Those are some of the arable farmers on the left, and let's say this is what inspired my payment by results. They really inspired my Nuffield. They really enjoy coming together as a group and learning. And we provide, we did a couple of farm walks with them. We got them together at the end of each year to share the results and for them to discuss how they were finding things. And they felt it was better use of public money and less bureaucratic and simple. On the challenging side, weather came up, and that whole element of risk, that there are factors outside of a farmer's control, and the dry, in particular in the second year we had a very dry spring, and for the winter bird food plot, those plots we asked them to establish an annual mix each year in the spring. So that second year we had a terribly dry spring, and it was all a bit sort of touch and go how it would, what would happen. But actually they did manage to do really well, but it was worrying. How do you manage some of these options that do have weather dependent aspects to them? Doing the self-assessment created quite a lot of debate. Some farmers really enjoyed it, and the whole point why we wanted self-assessment was so they would engage and get really involved and understand what we were trying to achieve. And but some others felt that it was quite time consuming. Interestingly, intensive farming of the plot versus wildlife benefits. That came out of the Arable pilot, and it was the winter bird food option where we put that focus on seed production. So we had farmers throwing everything at these plots, and in one plot, I don't know how much it had in terms of farm-yard manure and artificial on it, but you couldn't actually get into it, and it had 6 foot tall fat hen in, which I personally think is probably a record height for fat hen. And so what we were starting to lose in that desire for that seed head production was actually some of the habitat and the recognition of the habitat that these plots require, and the structure of them as well, which is quite important for how birds use them to feed. And so, how do you factor that into your results? And then the scalability. We were dealing with 4 discrete options or habitats that fall quite neatly within fields. How do you scale this up? So a field actually might have more than one feature in it. It might have something of historical importance as well as having species-rich grassland. Some things don't fit neatly within a field. So how do you scale up? And that's something actually that the test and trial is now moving on to consider. There was one thing that was published last year in the September test and trial report from the Defra test and trials. I thought I'd share that. The graph on the left talks about fairness and whether a payment by results feels fair compared to at mainstream agri-environments, the payment by management approach. And as you can see there, a lot of people, the farmers, think payment by results is more fair. 3 feel it's about the same. And then the graph on the right is, would you apply if you had a payment by results approach? Would it make you more or less likely to apply? And understandably, these farmers are all engaged in it already. They're really passionate about it, that the majority felt they would be more likely to apply. And so the last thing I thought I would leave you with is some conclusions, but some quotes before I move on to conclusions. So I think for me, it's and we did a couple of conferences at the end of the EU pilot, and the farmers, they were very much part of the conference, and they're the ones who really sold it. It's all very well me sitting here thinking, yes, this is a great idea, but actually it's the farmers themselves who really sold it. And this is some of the quotes that we took, and we did attitudinal surveys with them each year as well. But I think it's the fact the more you put in, the more you get out, and the fact you have more to lose, so you take greater care. And that interest and farming without bureaucracy, and a quote that one of the farmers said at the conferences is risk provides focus, when it was raised around that 0 payment rate. So just to move on to some conclusions. So these, again, this was taken from the EU report. The first one is about field testing. You've got to field test. And especially the proxy indicators, as I said, for 3 of the 4 options, we were looking at proxy indicators. So the only one we weren't was the species rich grassland one. And you also need to test it for more than 1 year, because you never quite know what any unintended consequences are going to be, like we saw with the winter bird food. And it's that ongoing validation. So you almost say 1 year of testing isn't really enough to really fully understand whether the results that you have, or the results that you have come up with in terms of what does good look like, and the assessment methodology to measure them, is 1 year really isn't enough to actually come to a firm conclusion about that. And then looking at the use of that sort of subjective assessment, so the results indicators based on subjective assessment. So a couple of the options, the pollen and nectar and the breeding wader, had percentage covers. And in particular for the breeding wader one, we were looking at the farmers to assess the percentage cover of rushes they had over the field that they put in. Now, trying to assess percentage rush cover on a field is not easy. And how do you try and ensure that you limit that subjective assessments and the impact that could have on the scoring? So you could have fewer payment tiers, but that could have a resulting impact on how incentivized people are. I've mentioned weather. It is a significant factor, as it says here, both for the delivery of the environmental and the agricultural outcomes. And as we know, a lot of the delivery of these habitats is closely linked to weather. So for example, the breeding wader habitat, you need wet, you want the grassland to be wet, you want scrapes, etc. to be wet. So if you have a dry spring, that is challenging. The birds may not be there, but that is completely out with the control of the farmer. So how do you factor that in, that does good look like a field with wet areas in, but that's out with the farmer's control. And how you apply safeguards in that truly exceptional weather events, so that you don't so that land managers and farmers aren't exposed to the level of risk. Where does that risk sit? Defined assessment windows, we felt we did define assessment windows. Some of them were quite large, but again, it was around that repeatability. Because we had the 100% verification with the advisors, we tried to ensure that the advisor and farmer assessed within quite a short space window, because these habitats change. So for example, with the species rich grassland, you would get different species flowering earlier on in the season than later. So if you left too big a gap between the farmer's assessment and the verification, they may come up with a different score, purely because some species had gone over. And that was the same actually with the pollen and nectar as well. So trying to have that window to ensure that any independent verification is as close as possible to a self-assessment. And then how to develop results criteria for habitats. And the example here is the breeding wader habitat, where we're targeting 4 different species of wader, but actually lapwing has slightly different requirements from the red shank, curlew and snipe. So how do they all use habitat for wet grass and for that in these areas up in the Yorkshire Dales? But how do you factor in something for lapwing? Do you have a slightly different set of results criteria? But as soon as you start to do that, you start to potentially complicate things. And the same with the winter bird food. So with winter bird food, some species require specific mixes. So corn bunting, for example, likes a very cereal heavy mix. So do you start to look at different results criteria for different plots aimed at different bird species, or do you do something generic? Because again, it's how do you it's that upscaling again. It's that upscaling question. How do you do this without it becoming complicated? And I put the website address on there. That would take you to our report that we published. And Peter, I think looking at time, I will stop there. So I won't go on to my Nuffield, but I'm just aware of time, and probably need to stop there, if that's okay.
That's grand, Vicky. That's very comprehensive, and I think actually I agree. We have a few questions here and a few jotted down myself. We'll maybe just go through the Q&A and have time afterwards. But I actually have watched your Nuffield presentation. Is available online. It's quite short, 12 minutes or something. I actually watched it a couple of days ago again, so it is available. That's on the knowledge transfer stuff. So, Vicky, just to touch on the topic of tonight of these schemes, you went through it in great detail there, and good practical stuff of what is actually happening on farms, as opposed to a criticism I would have of British politicians. It's a lot of I would call big talk, and not actually the fact that you went through there in detail about the mixes needed on the Arable scheme. It really puts it into perspective for farmers like me. Anyway, the question I have, Vicky, is just, in fairness, the trials there, particularly in the EU scheme, it's fairly low numbers of farmers were involved in it, and I'm just wondering, when this is rolled out nationally, I'm not even sure how many thousand farmers are in England. There's 25,000 in Northern Ireland. I'm sure there's a lot more in England. It's going to get very complicated very quickly, is it, for administering this. I'm just very aware that the Rural Payments Agency wouldn't have had a great reputation at all for administering the BPS, which was quite a simple scheme. So will it be fair to do this when things get complicated with the future schemes?
So first of all, no decision has been made as to whether or not this will be rolled out, Peter. So that's why it's one of the tests and trials. It's sort of testing the ambition around this, and the question is, not all habitats need or merit a payment by results approach. So some of the work that the test and trial is moving on to do is looking at, first of all, how could you upscale this? But also we're doing some work with Defra on, other habitats, would they, what does suit a payment by results approach? And also we're looking at what's called a hybrid approach. So with a hybrid approach, there's a basic payment and then it's sort of a performance bonus on top. So that's been looked at as well. And that's part of the test and trial extended the EU pilot by 2 years. And there's been a further extension, and part of that extension is looking at this hybrid approach. But no decision has been made on this because, for exactly the points you raised, and also, as I said, do you go down the self-assessment route? How do you verify this? How do you upscale it? So there's quite a few questions that still need to be answered, but it's still very much in the mix for potentially for some of the schemes, but it's not known yet what element it will fall into and what it will look like. So that's why it's one of the tests and trials. So before you panic and think this is going to be rolled out across all options and all habitats, it's not. That decision hasn't been made yet.
That's grand. And you just touched on it very briefly, and it's a point that's often made, around the whole cost incurred, income forgone model. I would argue that there's actually, it's not, the word incentive isn't correct. It's not incentive at all. You're just covering costs. So have you been looking at that, about, I suppose, what is the sweet spot there on certain measures, to get, to actually get uptake? I would suspect that the farmers that you have on the trials so far are already environmentally minded farmers in a way, if you know what I mean, or have the scope to have a big enough farm, they have that bit of nature set aside or whatever. But getting it rolled out to, what farmers are like, there's a huge variation and attitudes to this sort of stuff. Have you been looking at that, about what is the correct level of incentive, and I suppose as well, the point of I would argue that there's no harm in having a bit of profit, because this budget, to begin with, way back in the day, was to support farm incomes, so where are you at with that?
So Defra are looking at that. So Defra are a whole team working on payments, and they're very mindful of exactly the points you make, Peter, around our current approach and how farmers, especially if we're wanting them to change, there's a real risk attached to that. So how do you recognize that? So there are various work streams, and there's been lots of discussion around that. Where Defra are with that at the moment, I know Secretary of State at Groundswell last week was again referring to the payments and the need to incentivize and incentivize a sort of transformation to sustainable farming. Not quite sure what that looks like at the moment. But yeah, it is definitely a key topic within Defra. Obviously, the farmers, yes, that were involved in the pilot were self-selecting. So we again, they were interested in this. Interestingly, say in the Arable, they all had to be in existing countryside or environmental stewardship because of having that baseline plot. So they were all doing something. But I would say they were still a representative bunch. Up in the Yorkshire Dales, we had some farmers come in who'd never been in an agri-environment scheme before because they hadn't had one that they liked until this one came along. So we did have more of a mix up there of farmers who hadn't engaged with us and engaged in agri-environment schemes previously. But I would still say that we had a fairly representative bunch, and they were they were very they were opinionated. You know, we wanted opinionated farmers because that was the whole point of it. So they, you know, they were very honest with their views. So it wasn't all completely rosy, but they did sort of get a real enthusiasm and a real buzz about it. And I think it's that reward and recognition, a lot of which comes into it. And it also brought out that competitive spirit that we know that exists in the farming industry. And so we had farmers deliberately growing plots by the road so that their neighbours, you know, so they could be seen by their neighbours. And we had, I know in the wintering waders, we had, you know, farmers egging each other on, you know, in terms of going out to do their surveys and going, oh, I wouldn't go out today, you know, I'm going to get many more birds than you tomorrow, type of thing. So it brought out that competitive spirit, and that's something I've always wanted, you know, when farmers start comparing lapwing numbers as opposed to tons of wheat.
I was going to say, if that was in Northern Ireland, they'd probably be growing the plots furthest away from the road, so in case the farmers thought they were mad growing buttercups and stuff. But now, I suppose just a few questions here that people have sent in, Vicky, just in time we've left. How it was mentioned the farmers carry out a self-assessment annually, which transfers into a payment. Is there the intention to verify these annual assessments, and if so, how?
Yep, so they're verified by an advisor. So the farmers do the assessment, and then they are verified by an advisor, either from Natural England for the Arable or Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority, because one of the aims of both the EU project and the Defra was to look at that accuracy of self-assessment and the methodology. So if two people go out and do the same assessment, as I was saying, within a window, do you come up with the same results? So if you look at the EU pilot, there's some stats around that, and generally they were pretty close. I think they were slightly further away in those two options where we had slightly more subjective, so that percentage cover, whereas the species rich grassland and the winter bird food, there was less, they were closer, and I think the accuracy improved, I think from memory as well, as they went on, the difference got closer, so there wasn't such a difference between the farmer and the advisor.
And the other one there, Vicky, is which habitats would ABS not work on?
I think some of the simple habitats, so a grass margin is one that you just think, well, grass margin is a grass margin, there isn't necessarily that incentive. And I'm just thinking, we've just had an exercise with Defra on this, possibly some of the creation options to start with, or what you would have to have is you'd have to have sort of a milestone. So if you're looking to create species rich grass, and you wouldn't want to straight away give them the assessment methodology that we did for the species rich grass and for the Yorkshire Dales National Park, you would want to have, sort of milestones of delivery, so people weren't completely flawed from the beginning. So it would lend itself, but it would have to be done in a slightly different manner. So they're definitely those that are simpler to deliver.
Daryl's asked two questions here. In fairness, the first one I think was answered quite well in your presentation after he sent it through. Just the other one there is, in your opinion, has Defra listened to any of the farmers' recommendations for improvements where needed in these future schemes? So what has are Defra all ears to what the outcome of your work here at the minute, these pilots?
Yeah, I mean, Defra are listening. I say this is one of 60 tests and trials, so there's a lot going on, and there are over 3,000 farmers involved. They are interested. I think what's different, and what's with coming under domestic policy, is that the scheme will evolve, which is very different from where we were with CAP schemes, where what you launched on the first day was pretty much what you had then for the next 6 or 7 years, with limited scope for change. And obviously any change you had to go back to the European Union to seek agreement, whereas obviously under domestic policy we can be more agile in how we evolve and tweak the schemes. And I think that's quite a sort of different mentality to get for farmers to get their heads around. So sort of when it lands, the expectation is, right, well, this is it. Well, no, it's not it. Defra have been very clear that this scheme will evolve, it will iterate over the years as they learn. And with the Sustainable Farming Incentive Pilot, which phase 1 is launched, there's a whole learning strategy around it. So they really want to learn from those that are participating. So you've got tests and trials, and you've got a pilot. So all of them are feeding learning back, so that the schemes can be iterated as we go forward.
If I could just last question, it was from myself, as I thought I would have in some of this stuff. I'd be interested to hear your opinion, as you obviously have a lot of environmental background there, but also you are from a farm and you're like you studied agriculture at college and done a lot of your career. Is there a risk that we kind of have like almost a two-tier model of farming going forward in the UK, where there's just a certain, probably farmers on better quality land just don't bother with this sort of noise, or just get focused on production and that's all they're interested in, and then we have farmers with marginal land, or in fairness, farmers on good land who have plenty of land and can afford to set aside a certain amount. Is there a risk that we're going down that road where, with just kind of two types of farmers, or how do you design schemes to really get that middle ground and get a bit of nature crowbar into every farming system?
I mean, so first of all, you never know how people are going to react, and there's the whole land sharing or land sparing debate that goes on. My view, I like the idea of land sharing, especially when you consider the environment is not, it's wider than biodiversity. It's about soils, etc., water. Yeah, I think the idea behind the three separate schemes, in particular having the Sustainable Farming Incentive scheme that now forms part of what was ELMS, is that is high uptake. So it's going to have a standards approach. So the idea is you ideally put your whole farm in. You might do something for soils, you might do something for hedges, and then so you'd have a hedgerow standard. Within that, there are 3 different levels of ambition. This is what's come out in the pilot. So a farmer might choose to go in the lower level, they might choose to go in the higher level, to try and encourage as many people to get engaged. And as there should be something for everyone in there, but also what it's trying to do is to encourage people to sort of dip their toe in the water. And if they think, oh, actually, I can do this, then they've got their ambition to move up as well. So I mean, the hope, Peter, is very much that that we do get that big uptake, because to be honest, to deliver some of those objectives, especially around clean air, clean water, we need large scale uptake because they cover the whole country. And also with climate change, we know species are adapting, we know species are moving. We need to ensure that we provided space for them and the habitats for them to do so, and to link up habitats. So I hope it doesn't go down to very intensive agriculture and then sort of oases and habitat. I very much hope that all farmers can find some space for nature on their farm.
Vicky, that's great. Hey, thanks for going through that, even very comprehensive answers to those questions. So folks, at this point, we're going to dial off this Zoom call, and Heather Stewart has all sent members of NIIAS who are on tonight a separate email with a link to the AGM. So it'll be it'll be more like an ordinary Zoom meeting where we'll all have an opportunity to speak. So the plan is to really wrap through that in about 10 minutes. So we'll be finished up very shortly after 8 o'clock. So to the non-members, NIIAS, this is really the end of proceedings for yourselves. Just thanks for dialing in tonight, and just like on their behalf to thank Vicky for her presentation and for answering our questions. And of course, if you are interested in becoming a member of NIIAS, if you email Heather, she'll be more than happy to send you on the form to join for a sum of only £20 per year. So folks, thanks for that, and we'll talk to the NIIAS members now just literally immediately on the next call. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.